My name is Cassidy, 33 years old, and I have not spoken to my mother in 3 years. For my entire life, she treated me like an embarrassing burden while worshiping my lazy brother. She told our entire extended family that I was mentally unstable and called my hardworking husband a low-class mistake. So when her high-priced lawyer called me on a Tuesday morning demanding my presence to sign a document that would quote-unquote save me from financial ruin, I knew something was deeply wrong. They thought they could corner me. They forgot that I am a forensic accountant who hunts down financial fraud for a living. When I read what they actually wanted me to sign, I laughed so hard the lawyer physically recoiled. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family member who thought you were the weak link. The mahogany desk in Richard Evans' office was massive, designed to make anyone sitting on the opposite side feel small and intimidated. Richard, a man in his early 50s with a slicked-back hairline and a condescending smile, slid a thick stack of papers across the polished wood. A single yellow sticky note marked the signature line on the top document. It was a quitclaim deed. Richard leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers, looking at me like I was a confused child who needed guidance. He spoke in that slow, patronizing tone men like him reserve for women they think are foolish. Your mother, Brenda, is doing you a massive favor here, Cassidy. The family trust has encountered some unexpected tax liabilities. Complicated stuff, really. You do not need to worry your head about the details. Brenda is willing to assume the entire burden of the estate to protect you from the IRS. All you need to do is sign away your interest in the trust properties and you walk away completely clean. She is saving you from a massive headache. I did not say a word. I just sat there in the stiff guest chair staring at the glossy white paper. The silence in the room stretched out thick and heavy. Richard shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. The old me, the daughter who desperately craved her mother's approval, might have grabbed the pen and signed just to keep the peace. But 3 years of no contact had given me clarity, and 10 years in forensic accounting had given me a terrifying set of skills. I investigate corporate embezzlement, trace offshore shell companies, and untangle complex financial webs that put millionaires in federal prison. I do not get intimidated by a local lawyer in a cheap suit. I picked up the document, ignoring the sticky note, and flipped to the second page, then the third. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, bypassing the fluff and locking onto the numbers, the dates, and the specific liability clauses. Richard had made a fatal error. He assumed I was just a bitter, estranged daughter. He had no idea what I did for a living, because my mother had always lied to her country club friends, telling them I was merely a rude little bookkeeper. Within 60 seconds, the glaring legal loopholes jumped off the page like glowing neon signs. This was not a document designed to protect me from tax liabilities. It was a poorly disguised attempt to transfer the legal responsibility of an ongoing tax fraud investigation directly onto my shoulders. The trust was not just in debt. Someone had been illegally siphoning money from it, draining the principal and hiding the distributions. Brenda was not trying to save me. She was trying to frame me as the sole beneficiary of the stolen funds so she could walk away scot-free when the federal auditors came knocking. They were trying to make me the fall guy for federal tax evasion. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. It was so sloppy, so arrogant, and so utterly typical of my mother. A bubble of amusement started in my chest. I tried to suppress it, but the ridiculousness of the situation was too much. A small chuckle escaped my lips. Richard frowned, leaning forward. Then the chuckle turned into a full belly laugh. I sat in that quiet, overly air-conditioned office and laughed hysterically. It was a loud, unhinged sound that bounced off the wood-paneled walls. Richard looked completely bewildered, his condescending smile melting into a mask of pure panic. He actually recoiled, pressing himself flat against the back of his expensive leather chair as if my laughter was a physical weapon. "Are you all right, Cassidy?" Richard asked quietly, terrified. I wiped a tear of mirth from the corner of my eye and took a deep, steadying breath, instantly dropping the laughter. My face turned to stone. I reached into my designer leather tote bag and pulled out my favorite tool of the trade, a heavy crimson ink fountain pen. I uncapped it with a sharp, echoing click that made Richard flinch in his oversized leather chair. "I am more than all right, Richard," I replied, my voice dangerously calm and devoid of any warmth. "In fact, I am having the best Tuesday of my entire career." I stood up, leaned over his pristine mahogany desk, and flattened the quitclaim deed right in front of him. With swift, deliberate strokes, I began slashing through the paragraphs he had so carefully drafted. The scratch of the nib against the heavy cardstock was the only sound in the room. I drew a massive red circle around Section 4, Clause B. "Let us review your legal handiwork, counselor," I said, keeping my gaze locked on his increasingly sweaty forehead. "Right here you state that I am accepting retroactive responsibility for all capital gains taxes associated with the sale of the beachfront commercial properties. The problem is, I know for a fact my grandfather placed those exact properties in an irrevocable family trust. By law, you cannot sell them without the explicit notarized consent of every single living beneficiary. I never gave my consent. I have not spoken to anyone in my family in 36 months. Richard opened his mouth, stammering a weak defense, but I cut him off instantly, drawing a second, even darker circle on the third page of the document. "Then we have this beautiful little paragraph right here. You want me to acknowledge the receipt of a $2.5 million cash distribution that supposedly happened 18 months ago. A distribution that magically I am now responsible for paying federal income tax on." I tapped the red ink against the paper, leaving a bright, bloody-looking mark next to the fabricated number. Let me guess exactly what happened. My golden child brother Mason drove his ridiculous tech startup straight into bankruptcy around that exact time. He owed the wrong people money, and my mother needed liquid cash to cover his debts so her precious boy would not go to federal prison. So she drained the trust fund, forged the distribution logs to hide her tracks, and now that the Internal Revenue Service is auditing the estate, you two cooked up this fake legal document to make it look like I took the money. You want me to pay taxes on stolen funds I never received. Richard's face drained of all color, turning a sickly shade of gray. The smug, patriarchal lawyer who had condescended to me 5 minutes ago was completely gone. In his place sat a terrified, pathetic accomplice who suddenly realized he had just stepped blindly into a steel bear trap. "Cassidy, you are fundamentally misunderstanding the legal mechanism we are employing here," he croaked, tugging nervously at his suddenly tight collar. I slashed a giant red X across the signature line, tearing slightly into the paper. "I am a senior forensic accountant, Richard. I untangle offshore money laundering operations and track corporate embezzlement for breakfast. I know exactly what this legal mechanism is. It is conspiracy to commit tax evasion, wire fraud, and grand larceny. You did not just draft a bad contract to protect a client. You drafted a criminal confession and handed it directly to a certified fraud examiner." I picked up the ruined document, now bleeding with aggressive red ink, and threw it directly at his chest. It fluttered down onto his lap like trash. "You thought you were bringing in a naive, estranged daughter who would blindly sign anything to make her mommy happy and win back her affection," I said, grabbing my bag and straightening my posture. "What you actually did was hand a federal financial investigator hard documentary evidence of a felony." Richard was physically shaking now. He reached for his desk phone, likely to call Brenda in a sheer panic, but his hand hovered over the receiver, too paralyzed by fear to actually pick it up. "If I were you, Richard, I would start looking for a very good criminal defense attorney immediately. Because when I hand this over to my friends at the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, they are going to ask who drafted this fraudulent transfer of liability. And your signature is sitting right there at the bottom of page 4. Enjoy your disbarment." I turned on my heel and walked out of the office. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, sealing his fate. The adrenaline coursed through my veins, hot and electric. For years, my mother had painted me as the weak link, the emotional wreck who could not handle the pressure of our affluent family. Now I held the match that was going to burn her fake empire to the ground. I pushed through the glass revolving doors of the lobby and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. The bustling city streets felt entirely different today. They felt like pure, unadulterated victory. I walked confidently toward my car, a sleek, understated sedan that I had bought with my own hard-earned money, a stark contrast to the flashy leased sports cars my brother Mason loved to flaunt but could never actually afford. I unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat, shutting the door to block out the city noise. I took a moment to relish the quiet victory, resting my hands on the steering wheel, but before I could even press the ignition button, my phone shattered the silence. The screen lit up, vibrating aggressively against the center console. I glanced down, expecting a work call or maybe a quick text from my husband Derek. Instead, I froze completely. The name glowing brightly on the caller ID was one I had not seen in 3 long, peaceful years. It was Brenda. The trap had failed, the lawyer had undoubtedly sent a frantic text, and the queen bee was finally forced to break her silence. I took a deep breath, swiped the screen, and answered. "Hello, Brenda," I said, my voice perfectly level. There was no hesitation. My mother launched her attack with the practiced precision of a predator. "What is wrong with you, Cassidy?" Brenda shrieked through the speaker, her voice vibrating with artificial outrage. "Richard just called me hyperventilating. He said you walked into his office, threw a tantrum, destroyed a legal document, and threatened him. Are you completely unstable?" I pulled the phone away from my ear, letting her toxic energy dissipate. It was the same old script. Whenever Brenda was backed into a corner, she played the victim and painted whoever opposed her as insane. "I did not throw a tantrum, Brenda," I replied coolly. "I identified federal tax fraud. You and Richard tried to trick me into assuming the tax liability for the $2.5 million you illegally siphoned out of Grandpa's trust." "You are so incredibly selfish," she snapped, ignoring the accusation of theft. "We are trying to protect this family. We are trying to keep the estate intact, and you make these wild, paranoid accusations just to spite me. You always ruin things for everyone else." She paused to draw breath, seamlessly transitioning into the historical gaslighting that defined my childhood. "You ruin everything, just like you ruined your own college graduation," Brenda continued, her tone dripping with venom. "You made such a massive, embarrassing scene that day just because I took Mason to that wellness spa retreat in Sedona. Your brother was going through a deeply traumatic breakup and he needed his mother. But you expected me to sit in a sweltering hot stadium for 4 hours just to watch you walk across a stage for an accounting degree. You have absolutely no empathy for anyone but yourself." I gripped the steering wheel tight. She was actually using my graduation as ammunition. I had graduated summa cum laude entirely on scholarships because she refused to pay for a degree she deemed unglamorous. She and Mason had skipped the ceremony to get hot stone massages. When I expressed how hurt I was, she told our extended family I was having a mental breakdown. "You committed a felony, Brenda," I said, cutting through her manufactured drama. "I do not care about Sedona. I do not care about Mason's fake breakups. I care that you forged trust distribution logs. I am a forensic accountant. You handed me the murder weapon with your fingerprints all over it." "Cassidy, listen to me right now," she demanded, her voice dropping to a menacing hiss. "You are going to turn your car around. You are going to drive back to Richard's office. You are going to apologize for your psychotic episode, and you will sign that paper. If you do not, I will make sure everyone in this city knows how disturbed you really are. I will ruin your reputation. I will ruin that truck-driving husband of yours. You are nothing without this family." I felt a cold smile spread across my face. She still thought I was the scared 20-year-old girl begging for her love. "You do not have a family, Brenda," I said quietly. "You have a fragile ego and a failing bank account. Do not ever call this number again." Before she could utter another toxic syllable, I pulled the phone away and ended the call. The silence that rushed back into the car was intoxicating. I blocked her number immediately, tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, and pushed the ignition button. The engine purred to life, and I pulled out of the parking lot feeling lighter than I had in years. The drive back to the suburbs gave me time to decompress. I pulled into the sweeping driveway of the sprawling modern farmhouse Derek and I had built together. It was a beautiful, peaceful sanctuary surrounded by tall oak trees. a stark contrast to the chaotic, debt-ridden facade my mother maintained. I parked in the pristine garage, walked through the mudroom, and tossed my keys onto the kitchen island. The house was quiet. Derek was still at the corporate logistics center managing his fleet. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, ready to finally relax and put the bizarre morning behind me. But the peace lasted exactly 3 minutes. A violent, heavy pounding shook the front door. It was not a polite knock. It was the aggressive, frantic hammering of someone trying to break it down. I set my glass down on the counter, my heart rate spiking instantly. I walked down the wide hallway and checked the security camera monitor mounted on the wall. Standing on my front porch, his face flushed red with unhinged fury, and his fists balled tight at his sides, was my golden child brother Mason. I did not even have to unlock the deadbolt before he started rattling the brass handle aggressively. I opened the door and Mason pushed past me without a single word of greeting, bringing a gust of cold wind and the smell of his overpowering, overly expensive cologne into my foyer. He was not alone. Trailing cautiously behind him, looking deeply hesitant, was his wife Jasmine. Jasmine was a brilliant, self-made event planner. She was a stunning, ambitious African-American woman with razor-sharp instincts, but right now she looked profoundly uncomfortable. Mason grabbed her wrist and pulled her further into the entryway, clearly wanting an audience for his impending performance. "What is your absolute problem, Cassidy?" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings of my living room. "Mom just called me in hysterics. You went into Richard's office, completely lost your mind, and threatened a respected attorney. Do you have any idea what you just did to this family?" I closed the heavy front door calmly, leaning my back against the solid oak wood. "I declined to sign a fraudulent legal document, Mason." "That is exactly what I did." He marched past me straight into my kitchen, his face contorted with ugly rage. "You are going to sign it, or I swear to God I will sue you for everything you have. You are deliberately trying to bankrupt this family out of pure spite. You have always been insanely jealous of my success. You sit in your pathetic little life, crunching numbers for pennies, and you want to drag us down to your miserable level because you cannot stand that I made it big." As Mason continued his unhinged rant, throwing his arms around and threatening expensive legal action he could never actually afford, I shifted my attention entirely to Jasmine. She was not looking at Mason. She was staring intently at my house. Mason had spent years feeding Jasmine a very specific, carefully crafted narrative about me. He told her I was a bitter, unstable, low-level clerk who lived in a cramped, depressing apartment on the wrong side of town. He painted me as the ultimate family failure who was constantly begging for handouts. But as Jasmine stood in the center of my home, her keen eyes took in the undeniable reality. She looked at the sprawling, open-concept floor plan bathed in natural light. She noticed the custom-cut marble countertops, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking 2 acres of pristine private woodland, and the original modern artwork hanging on the freshly painted walls. I watched her gaze travel to the imported Italian leather sectional in the sunken living room and the state-of-the-art smart home security panel I had just used to check the cameras. This was not the home of a broke, pathetic sister. This was a multi-million-dollar custom estate, and Jasmine, who organized luxury corporate events for a living, knew premium quality when she saw it. Her expression shifted rapidly. The defensive posture she had walked in with melted away, replaced by deep, undeniable confusion. She looked at Mason, who was currently kicking one of my heavy brass bar stools, and screaming about how much I owed the family name. Then she looked back at me, standing calmly in my designer loungewear, completely unfazed by his explosive temper tantrum. Jasmine was an incredibly smart woman. I could practically see the gears turning behind her dark eyes. If Mason had lied this drastically about my financial situation, what else had he lied about? The realization seemed to hit her like a physical blow. She took a small, deliberate step away from him, wrapping her arms tightly around her chest as she reevaluated everything she knew about her husband. "I will take you to civil court!" Cassidy Mason screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "I will tie you up in endless litigation for the next decade. I will take every single dime you have ever saved." I sighed, walking over to the kitchen island and casually picking up my glass of sparkling water. You cannot afford a lawyer, Mason. You cannot even afford the monthly lease on that flashy Porsche you just parked in my driveway, which, by the way, is leaking oil onto my custom paving stones. His jaw dropped, a flash of genuine naked panic crossing his eyes before the arrogant anger returned red hot. You shut your mouth. You do not know the first thing about my corporate finances. I am building a real estate empire, and you are just a miserable, bitter accountant married to a grease monkey. Right on cue, the deep rumbling sound of a heavy diesel engine echoed through the quiet suburban neighborhood. I glanced out the large bay window. Pulling into the driveway, parking deliberately close to Mason's pristine leased sports car, was a beat-up 10-year-old pickup truck. It was covered in a light layer of industrial dust from the logistics yard, its heavy steel bumper slightly dented from years of hard labor. The driver's side door creaked open loudly, and my husband Derek stepped out. He was wearing heavy steel-toed work boots, faded denim jeans, and a plain gray t-shirt pulled tight across his broad shoulders. Mason turned his head and saw Derek walking slowly up the front pathway. A cruel, condescending smirk instantly replaced the panic on my brother's face. He puffed out his chest, smelling blood in the water. To Mason, Derek was the ultimate easy target, a working-class punchline he could use to regain his shattered ego. Mason cracked his knuckles, turned toward the front door, and prepared to attack. The heavy mahogany front door swung open before Mason could take a single step forward. Derek stepped into the foyer, wiping a smudge of engine grease from his thumb with a worn shop rag. He took one look at Mason, whose fists were still balled up in a ridiculous amateur fighting stance, and simply sighed, tossing the dirty rag onto a decorative side table. "Well," Derek said, his deep voice rumbling calmly through the tense air of the entryway, "I see the neighborhood stray has wandered inside our house again." Mason sneered, dropping his fists but puffing out his chest to compensate for the glaring fact that Derek was a good 4 inches taller and significantly broader in the shoulders. "Do not get smart with me, you grease monkey downgrade. I am here dealing with official family business. Things you would not possibly understand, because you are nothing but a glorified truck driver living off my sister's money." I watched Jasmine cringe in the background. The irony was physically painful. Derek owned a national logistics empire. His company operated hundreds of commercial trucks across the entire country. But my mother and brother had always been too arrogant to look past the fact that he liked to fix his own engines on the weekends. They assumed he was a blue-collar laborer I had settled for out of desperation. We never corrected them because watching them make absolute fools of themselves was highly entertaining. Derek did not yell. He did not even flinch. He walked past Mason as if my brother were a minor inconvenience, like a piece of chewing gum stuck to the bottom of his steel-toed boot. He walked straight into the kitchen, wrapped a heavy, comforting arm around my waist, and pressed a soft kiss to my temple. "Everything okay here, honey?" he asked, completely ignoring Mason, who was now seething behind him. "Just a little temper tantrum," I replied, leaning into his solid warmth. "Mason is upset because I refused to help him and Brenda commit federal tax fraud this morning." Derek chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated against my side. He reached into the front pocket of his faded denim jeans and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times, his eyes scanning something I could not see. He typed a single brief text message, hit send, and slid the phone back into his pocket with a satisfied smirk. "Well, since you are here making a complete fool of yourself, Mason," Derek said casually, walking over and opening the stainless steel refrigerator, "would you like a cold beer? It might help calm your fragile nerves before you have to leave, and trust me, you will be leaving very soon." "I do not want your cheap beer," Mason spat, marching into the kitchen to close the distance between them. "And I am absolutely not leaving until Cassidy signs that legal document. You both owe this family. We gave you everything. You gave her crippling anxiety and a massive complex." Derek corrected smoothly, popping the cap off a bottle of pale ale and taking a slow, deliberate sip. "And you have exactly 10 minutes before your day gets significantly worse, so I highly suggest you enjoy the premium air conditioning while you still can." Mason crossed his arms, looking completely bewildered, but determined to stand his ground in my kitchen. He launched into another unhinged tirade, screaming about impending lawsuits, demanding family loyalty, and raving about how he was going to make sure my professional reputation in the financial sector was ruined forever. Derek just leaned back against the cool granite island, drinking his beer in total silence, occasionally checking the heavy metal watch on his left wrist. I stood quietly beside him watching Jasmine. She was nervously shifting her weight from foot to foot, her eyes darting frantically between her enraged, red-faced husband and the absolute terrifying calm radiating from Derek. She knew something bad was coming. Exactly 10 minutes later, the heavy, unmistakable rumble of a commercial diesel engine echoed down our quiet suburban street. It was not Derek's pickup truck, it was much louder. Through the large bay window, I saw the flashing yellow strobe lights of a heavy-duty repo tow truck backing aggressively into my driveway. The operator, a burly man wearing a neon safety vest and a baseball cap, hopped out of the cab and immediately began unspooling the thick steel winch cable, dragging it straight toward Mason's pristine, leased white Porsche. Mason stopped speaking mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. He spun around, staring in horror through the glass window as the tow truck driver expertly hooked the heavy steel cable directly under the front chassis of the expensive sports car. "Hey," Mason shrieked, his voice cracking an entire octave higher than normal. "Hey, what is he doing? That is my car." "Actually," Derek said, setting his empty glass beer bottle down onto the granite counter with a solid thud, "it is the bank's car. You are 3 months behind on your luxury lease payments, Mason. I have a good buddy over at the local repo company. He mentioned yesterday they were actively looking for a white Porsche registered to a Mason who really likes to dodge debt collector phone calls. I just texted him your exact location. Consider it a neighborly favor. I am just helping you declutter your life." Mason let out a pathetic sound that was half scream, half sob. He sprinted out the front door, waving his arms wildly in the air and shouting threats at the indifferent repo man. Jasmine did not run out after him. She stood completely frozen in the center of my kitchen, the harsh reality of her husband's complete financial ruin washing over her face in real time. She looked at me, her dark eyes filled with a complex mixture of profound humiliation and desperate resolve. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a small, folded white paper napkin, and subtly dropped it onto the marble counter. Without a single word, she turned on her heel and walked out the door to join the circus outside. I stood in the sudden quiet of my kitchen, listening to the distant shouting outside. The heavy front door clicked shut behind Jasmine. Derek and I exchanged a long look. He took another sip of his beer while I walked slowly over to the kitchen island. The white paper napkin sat stark against the dark marble countertop. I reached out and carefully unfolded it. Written in hurried, elegant cursive using a thick black eyeliner pencil was a very short message. "The Coffee Bean on 5th. Tomorrow 2 p.m. Come alone." I stared at the dark letters, feeling a sudden rush of adrenaline. Jasmine was making a move. I slid the napkin across the granite surface toward Derek. He set his bottle down and read the hastily scrawled words, his expression hardening into a look of serious calculation. "She knows," Derek said quietly, his deep voice resonating in the spacious room. "She stood in our house and realized her husband has been lying to her about absolutely everything." I nodded, leaning against the counter. "Jasmine is not a fool," I said. "She built an incredibly successful event planning agency from the ground up. She is a highly intelligent, self-made woman. Mason probably charmed her with his fake tech bro persona and the illusion of family wealth. But watching his car get repossessed in front of the sister he claimed was destitute, that just shattered the illusion completely." Derek crossed his arms over his chest, leaning back against the refrigerator. "It is worse than just a repossessed car, Cassidy," he said, his tone turning grim. "I did not want to bother you with this earlier, but I have been doing some digging." Derek walked out of the kitchen and headed toward his home office. I followed him, my curiosity piqued. He sat down at his massive oak desk and woke up his computer monitors. "For the past few weeks, I have had my corporate compliance team running quiet background checks on your brothers, supposedly booming real estate and tech ventures." Derek explained, clicking through several digital files. Since your mother started bragging about his new massive development project at the country club, I figured I should verify who we are really dealing with. He turned one of the large monitors toward me. The screen was filled with complex corporate registry documents. There is no real estate empire, Cassidy, Derek said plainly. It is all smoke and mirrors. Mason registered a dozen different limited liability companies over the last 4 years. But every single one of them is a shell company. They have no actual assets, no physical offices, and zero payroll. I leaned closer to the screen, my forensic accounting instincts immediately kicking into high gear. I scanned the balance sheets Derek had managed to pull. It was a complete and utter disaster. This level of financial negligence is actually staggering even for someone as irresponsible as my brother. He is just moving debt around, I whispered, tracing a line of red numbers with my finger. He takes out a high-interest loan under one shell company to pay the minimum balance on another. It is a classic corporate shell game. Exactly. Derek nodded. He has maxed out every line of credit he can legally access. He is completely leveraged. And based on these public lien notices, he has not paid state taxes in 2 years. I stepped back from the desk, the pieces of the puzzle violently snapping into place. The fraudulent document Richard tried to force me to sign this morning, the desperate phone call from my mother, and now Mason's unhinged visit. They are not just greedy, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. They are drowning. Brenda and Mason are completely underwater, and they were trying to use me as a life raft to survive a federal audit. Derek stood up and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a protective embrace. And now Jasmine is trapped on that sinking ship with them, he said. She is reaching out to you because you are the only one who actually knows how to read the water. I looked back at the hallway leading to the kitchen where the napkins still lay on the counter. My mother had spent my entire life making me feel small, worthless, and entirely dependent on her approval. Now she was facing financial ruin, and the only person who could expose the depth of her crimes was the daughter she discarded. I am going to that coffee shop, I said firmly. I am going to meet Jasmine, and I am going to help her burn their fake empire to the ground. Tomorrow afternoon will change everything for this profoundly toxic family. We just have to be completely prepared for the inevitable fallout. The next day, at precisely 2 in the afternoon, I walked into the Coffee Bean on Fifth Avenue. It was a trendy, bustling cafe downtown, a safe distance from my suburban neighborhood, and completely removed from the country club circles my mother frequented. I spotted Jasmine immediately. She was sitting in a quiet corner booth nursing a black coffee. Even completely stressed out, she looked impeccable, wearing a tailored blazer and a silk blouse that screamed quiet professionalism. But as I slid into the booth across from her, I saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around her dark eyes. The polite, polished facade she always maintained at family gatherings was entirely gone. She just looked incredibly tired. "Thank you for coming, Cassidy," she said, her voice low and steady. "I know we have never really been close. Your mother always made sure we stayed in our separate corners." I nodded, signaling the barista for an espresso. "Brenda operates by dividing and conquering," I said. "If you and I ever actually sat down and talked, we might have realized we were both being played." Jasmine let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Played is an understatement," she said, wrapping both hands around her warm mug. "Mason told me you were a financial disaster. He said you begged him for loans constantly, and that your husband was a deadbeat who could not hold down a job. He used that narrative to explain why he was always giving your mother so much cash. He told me he was trying to protect you." I felt a flash of hot anger, but I kept my expression neutral. "He was projecting," I told her. "Derek owns a national logistics firm, and I'm a forensic accountant. The only people in this family begging for money are Mason and Brenda." Jasmine's eyes widened slightly at the mention of my actual profession. "A forensic accountant," she repeated. Her posture shifted slightly, as if a heavy weight was beginning to lift off her shoulders. "Well then, I definitely called the right person." She took a deep breath, bracing herself. "Cassidy, I am ruined," she admitted, the vulnerability cracking her confident exterior. I worked 80-hour weeks for 6 years to build my event planning agency. I secured high-profile corporate clients. I did everything right. But 3 weeks ago, I got a call from a vendor saying my company credit card was declined. I leaned forward, giving her my full attention. When I logged into the business accounts, everything was gone. Jasmine continued, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed rage. Every single dollar of our joint savings, the business emergency fund, the tax reserves, all of it was transferred out. Mason forged my signature and maxed out 3 different lines of credit in my name. He leveraged my entire company to fund his offshore sports betting addiction. I stared at her, processing the sheer magnitude of his betrayal. Mason was not just a bad businessman, he was actively destroying his wife's life to cover his tracks. Have you confronted him about the missing funds? I asked. Jasmine shook her head bitterly. I tried. He gaslighted me completely. He told me the money was tied up in a massive new real estate development project on the West Coast. He swore he was about to close a deal that would quadruple our investment. He said I just did not understand high-level corporate finance. I took a sip of my espresso, the bitter taste grounding me. There is no real estate development, Jasmine, I told her gently. Derek ran a full background check on Mason's limited liability companies yesterday. They are all empty shell corporations. He is broke, and he is drowning in debt. Jasmine closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking down her cheek. She wiped it away furiously, refusing to break down in public. That is what I suspected when I saw your house yesterday, she whispered. When Derek casually mentioned the repo guy and I watched Mason's car get towed, it all clicked. He is a fraud. The whole family is a fraud. She opened her eyes and they were hard and cold, filled with the kind of fierce determination I deeply respected. I am a black woman who built an empire in a predominantly white industry, Cassidy. I am not going to let your entitled, mediocre brother drag me down into federal prison with him. She reached into her designer leather handbag and pulled out a small, sleek silver USB drive. She placed it on the wooden table between us. I waited until he fell asleep last night, and I cloned his entire hard drive, she said, sliding the small device across the table toward me. I do not know how to read these files. He has everything locked behind multiple encrypted folders and disguised as overseas vendor payments. But if you really are a forensic accountant, I need you to rip his finances apart. I need proof of exactly what he stole from me, so I can give it to my divorce attorney and the police. I looked at the silver drive resting on the table. It was the smoking gun. It was the exact weapon I needed to connect Mason's gambling debts directly to Brenda's trust fund fraud. I reached out and closed my hand over the USB drive. I will not just rip his finances apart, Jasmine. I promised, my voice low and dangerous. I am going to track every single stolen penny, and when I am done, they will not have a single place left to hide. I left the coffee shop with the silver USB drive burning a hole in my pocket. The drive back to my house felt like a blur. When I walked through the front door, Derek was in the living room on a conference call, but he saw the look in my eye and gave me a silent nod. I headed straight for my home office and locked the heavy oak door behind me. I booted up my secondary laptop. It was an air-gapped machine I used specifically for untangling malicious financial webs, completely disconnected from our home network to prevent any remote wiping. I plugged the silver drive into the port. A folder popped up on the screen titled simply as Vendor Invoices 2023. It was almost insulting how basic Mason's attempts at deception were. He had placed a generic password lock on the primary folder, probably thinking it would keep Jasmine out. I bypassed his amateur security measure in under 4 minutes using a brute force decryption program. The folder burst open, spilling hundreds of subdirectories across my screen. I cracked my knuckles and went to work. The next 4 hours were a masterclass in uncovering sheer financial stupidity. I started by tracing the money Mason had stolen from Jasmine. It was a chaotic trail of wire transfers originating from her business accounts. He had funneled her hard-earned profits through a series of anonymous digital wallets. From there, the money vanished into 3 different offshore sports betting syndicates based out of Costa Rica. He was not just placing casual bets. He was dropping $50,000 at a time on high-stakes international matches and losing consistently. The ledger showed a staggering net loss. Jasmine was completely wiped out, but her stolen money only accounted for a fraction of Mason's extravagant lifestyle. The leased sports cars, the custom-tailored suits, the expensive country club memberships they required millions of dollars to maintain. So I dug deeper to find the main artery of their cash flow. I cross-referenced Mason's incoming deposits with the corporate public records Derek had pulled yesterday. That is when the true terrifying scale of the conspiracy illuminated my computer screen. My mother was his hidden financier. I found a hidden directory labeled Estate Management. Inside were digital copies of bank statements from my late grandfather's irrevocable trust. Brenda was the executor, but she was legally prohibited from touching the principal balance. Yet the statements showed massive, unauthorized withdrawals. Brenda had been quietly bleeding the trust dry for the past 3 years. She was taking out predatory loans using the trust properties as collateral and funneling the cash directly into Mason's shell companies under the guise of venture capital investments. She was borrowing millions against assets she did not outright own to float a son who was gambling it all away. This was the exact reason they desperately needed me to sign that fraudulent document yesterday morning. The federal tax auditors were finally closing in on the trust, and Brenda needed a gullible scapegoat to take the fall for the missing millions. It was a textbook case of wire fraud and grand larceny. But as I sat there and stared at the horrifying balance sheets, a glaring question remained. How had they managed to keep all of the aggressive creditors at bay for this long? With this extreme level of debt, the local banks should have foreclosed on absolutely everything my mother owned months ago. I immediately ran a targeted search query through Mason's master ledger, looking for any positive asset entries. One single file popped up, highlighted in bold red text. It was boldly labeled, "The West Coast Resort Project." I quickly opened the file, and my jaw slowly dropped. It was a massive commercial real estate portfolio. According to Mason's falsified legal documents, this project was valued at nearly $40 million. He had used this fake asset as collateral to appease the angry lenders and keep Brenda out of federal prison. The entire project was a complete fabrication. It was just an empty plot of worthless swampland he had purchased for pennies. But he had maliciously doctored the environmental appraisals to make it look like a fully funded luxury development. And then I found the most recent email thread saved at the very bottom of the folder. Brenda was actively brokering a high-stakes deal to sell this fake resort to a private equity firm next week. She was planning to use the cash from the fraudulent sale to replace the stolen trust fund money before the government could audit her. I sat back in my leather chair, my heart pounding against my ribs. They were about to commit an even bigger felony to cover up the first one. I sat in the glow of my monitors, the magnitude of my mother's impending crime washing over me. Before I could formulate a concrete plan to expose the fake resort sale, my personal cell phone buzzed violently on the desk. It was a text message from an unknown number, but the venomous tone was unmistakably Brenda. She had realized her intimidation tactics at the lawyer's office had completely failed. Since I had blocked her primary number yesterday afternoon, she had clearly resorted to using a burner phone just to bypass my boundaries. The message was short, arrogant, and dripping with absolute malice. Tell your truck driver husband that actions have consequences. My stomach plummeted straight to the floor. I knew my mother better than anyone. When she could not control someone directly through emotional manipulation, she actively destroyed the things they loved. I grabbed my phone and sprinted out of the home office, finding Derek in the spacious living room. He had finished his corporate conference call and was currently staring at his tablet with a slight confused frown on his face. I rushed over to the sofa and shoved the phone screen toward him. "Derek," I said, my voice tight with rising panic. "What did she do? Tell me right now." He let out a long breath, set his tablet down on the coffee table, and rubbed the back of his neck. "2 of our mid-level regional shipping contracts just got abruptly canceled about 20 minutes ago," he explained calmly. his deep voice showing absolutely no signs of panic. Both of those commercial accounts belong to retail distributors whose senior vice presidents happen to play tennis at the exclusive Pine Valley Country Club. The realization hit me like a bucket of ice water. Pine Valley was the exact same elite country club where my mother held court every Tuesday afternoon, sipping excessively expensive wine and spreading vicious gossip to anyone who would listen. She had weaponized her social influence to manipulate these snobby executives into pulling their lucrative business from Derek's logistics firm. I could easily picture the scene. Brenda probably sat in the clubhouse dining room pretending to cry, spinning a tragic lie about how my dangerous husband was abusing her daughter and stealing the family money. She used her fake high society status to poison his professional reputation. Did they give a valid reason for terminating the partnership? I asked, my hands shaking slightly. Derek shook his head. They canceled effective immediately, breaking the standard vendor agreements without even providing a customary 30-day notice. They cited restructuring, but the timing is entirely too convenient. Your mother definitely orchestrated this little ambush. The guilt hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Derek had spent the last decade building his national logistics empire from the absolutely ground up. He started with a single used truck driving cross-country routes and working brutally long hours to establish a flawless reputation in a highly competitive industry. Now my toxic family was actively trying to dismantle his hard work just to punish me for refusing to take the fall for their federal tax fraud. I am so incredibly sorry, I whispered, feeling hot tears prick the corners of my eyes. I paced across the living room carpet, my forensic accounting brain racing to find a solution. I will call their corporate offices first thing tomorrow morning. I will hire a litigation team and threaten both of those executives with a massive breach of contract lawsuit. I will fix this mess, Derek. I promise you, I will fix it. I stopped pacing and braced myself for his anger. I fully expected him to yell to express frustration or to demand that I finally confront my mother face to face. Instead, a slow, genuine smile spread across Derek's handsome face. That warm smile quickly turned into a quiet chuckle and then a full, deep laugh that echoed loudly in the high-ceilinged living room. He was not angry. He was not stressed. He was highly amused. He stood up from the sofa, walked over, and wrapped a strong, reassuring arm around my shoulders. "You do not need to call any lawyers, Cassidy," he said, his eyes sparkling with a dangerous kind of excitement I rarely saw outside of his boardroom negotiations. "And you certainly do not need to apologize for your mother's pathetic attempt at corporate sabotage." He gently guided me back down the hallway toward his own home office, cracking his knuckles like he did before solving a mechanical issue. "Let me show you exactly why your mother is playing checkers, while I am playing a completely different game," he murmured. He sat down in his heavy leather desk chair, cracked a confident grin, and booted up his computer. The massive curved monitors flickered to life, illuminating Derek's face in a cool blue light. He typed in a complex series of passwords and opened a secure financial dashboard that I had never seen before. For years, my family had mocked him as a simple mechanic or a low-wage delivery driver because he preferred to get his hands dirty on the weekends rather than play golf. They never bothered to actually ask what the name of his company was or how it operated. Derek turned the primary monitor toward me. "Look at the top left corner, Cassidy," he instructed, leaning back in his chair. I squinted at the high-resolution screen. Embossed in a sleek silver digital font was a corporate logo I recognized immediately from industry trade magazines. D&C Holdings. My breath caught in my throat. "Wait," I whispered, pointing at the screen. "You are D&C Holdings, the national conglomerate that just bought out the Midwestern Freight Railway system last quarter." Derek smiled, a genuine warm expression that reached his eyes. "D for Derek and C for Cassidy," he said softly. "I incorporated the holding company the year we got married. I do not just own a few delivery trucks, honey. I own the supply chain. I own the warehouses, the transport fleets, and the distribution hubs. I am the chief executive officer of a billion-dollar private equity logistics firm. And because your mother and brother are too arrogant to look past my denim jeans and work boots, They have absolutely no idea who they just tried to wage war against. He clicked his mouse, opening a fresh digital portfolio. Now let us talk about those two snobby executives from the country club who just canceled our regional shipping contracts. He tapped the screen, pulling up an organizational chart for a massive retail distribution network. Those two men work for a subsidiary of a parent company called Apex Global Retail. I nodded slowly, following his logic. Yes, I know Apex. They are a massive player in commercial retail. They were a massive player, Derek corrected, his grin widening into something distinctly predatory. Until yesterday afternoon. My acquisition team has been quietly buying up a controlling majority stake in Apex Global Retail for the past 8 months. The final paperwork cleared the Federal Trade Commission yesterday, which means, as of this morning, DNC Holdings officially owns their parent company. My eyes widened as the sheer magnitude of his corporate trap snapped into focus. You are their boss. I realized, my voice filled with awe. You own the company that employs the men Brenda just manipulated. I am not just their boss, Derek said, his fingers flying across his mechanical keyboard. I am the man who dictates their corporate budget. And firing a vendor without proper legal notice or a valid operational reason is a direct violation of their executive contracts. They let a gossiping woman at a country club convince them to breach their fiduciary duty. That is a massive corporate liability. He opened his email client and drafted a new message. He copied the legal department and the human resources division of Apex Global Retail. I watched in absolute fascination as my husband typed out a lethal, beautifully worded corporate execution. He cited the exact clauses they had violated by canceling the shipping contracts on a whim. He outlined the financial damage their reckless decision could have caused the parent company. And then he formally terminated both of their employment contracts, effective immediately, with cause stripping them of their lucrative severance packages. Derek did not even hesitate. He hit send. By the time those two men finish their expensive martinis at the country club, they will be permanently locked out of their corporate email accounts and their company cars will be repossessed, Derek said calmly, shutting down the email client. Your mother thought she could use her fake social influence to hurt our family. All she actually did was get her two wealthy country club friends fired and blacklisted from the entire logistics industry. I stood there in the quiet office, completely overwhelmed by the brilliant, ruthless way he had protected us. My mother had poked a sleeping bear, and the bear had just swallowed her allies whole. Derek closed the corporate dashboard and opened a new browser tab. He navigated to the public real estate listing site and typed in a specific commercial property code. The fake West Coast resort project from Mason's decrypted hard drive appeared on the screen, complete with Brenda's contact information listed as the primary selling broker. He turned his chair to face me, his expression hardening into cold determination. He reached out and took my hand. Now let us go buy your mother's fake resort. I stared at him, the absolute audacity of his plan, sending a thrill straight down my spine. Buy it? I repeated slowly. You want to use D&C Holdings to purchase the worthless swampland they are trying to pass off as a luxury commercial development. Exactly, Derek said, opening a secure communication channel to his legal team. If they sell it to an actual private equity firm, they might get away with the fraud just long enough to replace the stolen trust fund money. But if my acquisitions department steps in as an anonymous buyer through a blind proxy, we control the entire board. We dictate the timeline, and we trap them in a legally binding contract that requires full financial disclosure. They will be so blinded by the dollar signs, they will never even look at the man behind the curtain. It was a brilliant strategy. I leaned down and kissed his cheek. Make the offer, I told him, and make it high enough that my greedy mother will not even think twice about accepting it immediately. While Derek set his corporate hounds loose on the real estate market, I walked back into my home office and locked the door. It was time to build the ultimate trap. I sat down at my air-gapped laptop and opened a completely fresh digital workspace. I spent the next 14 hours doing what I do best. I built an airtight, undeniable case of federal tax fraud and grand larceny. I started by organizing the encrypted files Jasmine had pulled from Mason's hard drive. I created a clean linear timeline mapping every single dollar Mason had stolen from Jasmine's event planning agency. Then I overlaid that timeline with the fraudulent withdrawals Brenda had made from my grandfather's irrevocable trust. I color-coded the wire transfers, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the trust money was being funneled into offshore sports betting syndicates to cover Mason's gambling debts. I meticulously documented the forged distribution logs Brenda and Richard had created to hide the missing millions. Finally, I compiled the falsified environmental appraisals and the fake architectural blueprints Mason had used to inflate the value of the West Coast resort project. I packaged all of it into a single highly encrypted digital dossier. It was not just a random collection of suspicious bank statements poorly hidden behind a basic security wall. It was a comprehensive, complete chronological narrative of a massive multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy that spanned across state lines and directly involved multiple major financial institutions. I opened a secure federal portal on my secondary monitor. I navigated directly to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division website. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a fraction of a second. I was about to officially report my own mother and my brother for federal felonies. Society conditions us to protect our family at all costs, to sweep their toxicity under the rug and suffer in silence just to keep the peace. But as I looked at the evidence of their relentless greed and remembered the years of emotional abuse, the gaslighting, and the deliberate attempts to ruin my husband, I felt absolutely no guilt. I only felt a cold, profound sense of justice. I filled out Form 211, the official application for award for original information. The IRS whistleblower program is designed specifically for financial professionals who uncover massive tax evasion schemes. If the evidence leads to a successful prosecution and the recovery of stolen funds, the whistleblower is legally entitled to a percentage of the recovered assets. But I did not care about the money. I cared about the undeniable permanent consequences. I attached the encrypted dossier, filled out my professional credentials, and hit submit. The confirmation screen glowed brightly in the dim office. The wheels of the federal government had officially begun to turn. Within 48 hours, an elite, highly trained team of federal forensic agents would open a quiet but aggressive preliminary investigation into the entire family trust. They would start pulling every single one of their bank records, issuing silent subpoenas to their lenders, and permanently freezing their offshore accounts, before Brenda and Mason even realized they were being actively watched by the government. The trap was set, and the steel jaws were firmly locked into place with absolute precision. I shut down my laptop, feeling a deep, overwhelming sense of relief wash over me. I walked straight into the large kitchen to pour myself a glass of water. Just as I took a sip, my cell phone buzzed. It was a text from Jasmine containing an exclusive invitation. Brenda was throwing a massive, lavish gala downtown next Saturday night to publicly announce the fraudulent sale of the fake West Coast resort project. The week passed in a blur of calculated anticipation. Saturday evening arrived carrying an electric current of impending justice. I stood in the exact center of my expansive walk-in closet, staring at the garment bag Derek had brought home for me. We were not just attending a party tonight. We were executing a hostile takeover of my mother's carefully constructed social reality. I unzipped the heavy canvas bag, revealing a custom-tailored emerald green silk gown. It was a masterpiece of modern design, sleek, powerful, and completely unforgiving. I slipped the dress on, feeling the cool, heavy silk drape perfectly across my shoulders and cascade down to the floor. As I stood in front of the full-length mirror, adjusting the delicate diamond tennis bracelet Derek had gifted me for our anniversary, my mind drifted back to all the previous family events I had endured. For my entire life, attending any gathering hosted by Brenda meant preparing for a psychological battle. I remembered Thanksgiving dinners where I was intentionally seated at a small, wobbly table near the swinging kitchen doors, while Mason was placed at the head of the formal dining room, drinking expensive scotch. I remembered my own college graduation dinner, where Brenda spent the entire evening loudly praising Mason's non-existent tech startup to everyone within earshot while waving off my new accounting position as depressing, low-class number crunching that would lead nowhere. She made sure I felt completely invisible. At every single holiday party, every wedding, and every country club mixer, I was the designated scapegoat. I was the prop Brenda used to make herself look like a long-suffering saint, burdened with an awkward, ungrateful daughter who simply could not measure up to the family standard. She would intentionally buy me dresses that were 2 sizes too large, just to make me look frumpy and unkempt, standing next to Mason's tailored designer suits. She conditioned the rest of our extended family to view me as a quiet, miserable failure, and for a long time I believed them. But looking at my reflection tonight, I saw absolutely none of that scared, lonely girl. The woman staring back at me was a senior forensic auditor who held the undeniable proof of federal felonies in the palm of her hand. Tonight, I was not the victim begging for crumbs of affection. I was the executioner preparing to deliver absolute justice. Derek walked into the closet, stepping up behind me. I caught his reflection in the glass and my breath hitched. He had completely shed the faded denim jeans and the grease-stained work shirts he normally wore to irritate my snobby relatives. Tonight, he was fully armed for high-stakes corporate warfare. He wore a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo, tailored perfectly to his broad shoulders, with a crisp white dress shirt and a subtle silk bow tie. He looked exactly like what he was: the ruthless, highly successful chief executive officer of a billion-dollar national logistics empire preparing to crush his competition. He rested his hands gently on my waist, pressing a soft kiss to my bare shoulder. "You look absolutely lethal, Cassidy," he murmured, his deep voice vibrating through the quiet room. "Are you ready to go buy some swampland and expose the biggest fraud in this city?" I smiled, leaning back into his solid strength. "I have never been more ready for anything in my entire life," I replied. We walked out of the house, leaving the beat-up pickup truck in the garage. Instead, Derek tossed the keys to his personal security driver, who was waiting for us at the end of the driveway in a pristine black luxury town car. The drive into the downtown district was completely silent. But it was not a tense silence. It was the calm, focused quiet of two professionals preparing to close the most important deal of their lives. I watched the bright city lights blur past the tinted windows, visualizing the encrypted dossier currently sitting on the desks of the federal agents. The town car smoothly navigated the busy downtown traffic and turned onto the grand circular driveway of the most expensive historic hotel in the city. The venue was glowing with elaborate lighting and aggressive displays of wealth. Paparazzi and local society photographers were flashing cameras near the velvet ropes, attempting to capture images of the wealthy investors walking inside. Derek stepped out of the car first, buttoning his tuxedo jacket before extending a hand to help me out. As my heels touched the polished marble entryway, I looked past the valet stand and saw her. Brenda was standing right at the massive gilded double doors of the main ballroom, greeting the arriving local elite with a blinding and completely fake smile on her face. Derek placed his hand firmly on the small of my back, gently guiding me up the sweeping marble staircase. The lobby of the historic hotel was buzzing with the quiet, elegant chatter of the city's most wealthy investors and socialites. Brenda was holding court near the entrance, wearing an overly dramatic silver-sequined gown that looked a bit desperate rather than elegant. She was laughing brightly with a local banking executive, but the moment her eyes locked onto us, her laughter died instantly. I watched the blood drain completely from her face. She excused herself abruptly from the wealthy banker and practically sprinted toward us, her heavy silk skirt swishing aggressively against the polished floor. She stepped directly into our path, physically blocking the entrance to the ballroom. Her blinding public smile remained glued to her face for the benefit of the surrounding guests, but her eyes were cold and furious. "What on earth are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice barely a whisper, but laced with absolute venom. "You were absolutely not invited to this event, Cassidy." "And bringing him," Brenda sneered, raking her eyes up and down Derek's impeccable tuxedo. Did he rent that cheap suit from a strip mall? You are embarrassing this entire family. Leave right now before I have the event security throw you both out into the street where you belong. I did not flinch. I did not shrink away like I had 1,000 times before when she used her harsh words to cut me down. Instead, I took a deliberate step forward, invading her personal space, and smiled radiantly. Oh, Mother, I projected my voice clearly and brightly, ensuring that the nearby guests, including the banking executive, could hear every single word. It is so wonderful to see you too. We simply could not miss such a monumental family celebration. And I have to say, the floral arrangements you chose are absolutely breathtaking. The white orchids are such an incredibly sophisticated touch. You always did have the best eye for event design. Brenda froze, completely trapped in her own web of rigid social expectations. Several wealthy guests turned to look at us, smiling approvingly at the beautiful mother and daughter reunion. She could not scream. She could not call security without creating a massive public scandal right in front of the private equity investors she desperately needed to impress. She was forced to swallow her absolute rage and maintain the illusion of the perfect, happy family. "Thank you, darling," Brenda choked out. Her jaw clenched so tightly I thought her teeth might crack under the pressure. She stepped aside, her body rigid with barely suppressed anger, unable to maintain the physical blockade any longer. Derek offered her a polite, confident nod, completely unfazed by her childish, petty insults. "Good evening, Brenda," he said smoothly, his deep voice carrying an undercurrent of lethal amusement. "Beautiful party you have put together tonight." We left her standing there, seething in silent fury, and walked straight through the gilded double doors together. The main ballroom was spectacular and overwhelmingly lavish. Crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring ceiling, casting a warm, golden glow over the massive room. Waiters in crisp white coats circulated gracefully with silver trays of expensive vintage champagne and delicate imported hors d'oeuvres. The room was packed with the local elite, all oblivious to the fact that they were attending a celebration of federal tax fraud. It was a multi-million-dollar illusion funded entirely by money stolen from my grandfather's trust. I scanned the crowded room and spotted Jasmine standing quietly near the back wall, looking stunning and fiercely composed in a simple, elegant black dress. She caught my eye over the heads of the crowd and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of solidarity. The financial evidence was already in the hands of the federal government. The corporate trap was already set by Derek's acquisition team. The final pieces of our absolute revenge were moving perfectly into place right under my mother's nose. The low, sophisticated murmur of the wealthy crowd was suddenly interrupted by a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the elegant music. Mason had strutted confidently up to the grand stage at the very front of the ballroom. He stood behind a clear acrylic podium, looking incredibly smug and arrogant in a flashy velvet dinner jacket that he definitely could not afford. He smiled out at the sea of investors and tapped his microphone 3 times, sending a loud, sharp echo across the massive room to command their full attention. He cleared his throat, adjusting his posture as he prepared to announce his monumental real estate triumph to the entire world. "Welcome, everyone," Mason began, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. "I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. I see the titans of our city. I see visionaries, bankers, and developers who understand that true success is not handed to you. It is forged in the fires of relentless ambition and tireless hard work." He paused for dramatic effect, soaking in the respectful silence of the wealthy crowd. "Nobody knows the value of hard work better than I do. For the past 4 years, I have poured my absolute blood, sweat, and tears into a singular vision. I have faced countless obstacles, sleepless nights, and endless doubts from people who simply could not see the bigger picture. I watched him from the back of the room, feeling a wave of absolute disgust. The only blood, sweat, and tears Mason had ever shed were over losing high-stakes poker games and dodging debt collectors. But the crowd of elite investors hung onto his every word, mesmerized by his practiced charisma. He paced slowly across the stage, holding the microphone like a seasoned politician. When I first conceptualized the West Coast Resort project, people called me Crazy Mason, continued. They said the land was too raw, the market was too volatile, and the sheer scale of the luxury development was too ambitious for a young entrepreneur. But I knew what I possessed. I had a vision to transform barren coastline into the most exclusive luxury commercial property in the entire country. And I knew that building a legacy requires taking massive calculated risks. He gestured toward our mother, who was standing near the front of the stage, beaming with sickening pride. My mother, Brenda, taught me that the family legacy must be protected and elevated at all costs, Mason declared, placing a hand over his heart. She believed in my vision when no one else did. She provided the foundational support that allowed me to weather the economic storms. He was speaking in code. By foundational support, he meant illegally draining my grandfather's irrevocable trust fund to float his offshore gambling debts and keep his shell companies from collapsing. But to the clueless investors in the room, it sounded like a touching tribute to a loving mother. The applause rippled through the ballroom. Mason held up his hand, demanding silence once again. He leaned closer to the microphone, his eyes gleaming with greedy triumph. Tonight, I am not just standing here to talk about my past struggles. I am standing here to proudly announce a truly monumental victory. As of yesterday afternoon, my firm has officially reached an agreement with a massive, highly respected private equity group. They have reviewed our flawless environmental appraisals and our architectural blueprints. They recognize the undeniable value of the West Coast Resort project, and they have agreed to fully acquire the entire development portfolio in a historic multi-million-dollar buyout. The massive ballroom immediately erupted into loud cheers and wildly enthusiastic applause. Brenda wiped a fake tear of joy from her eye, playing the role of the proud matriarch to absolute perfection. They thought they had pulled it off. They believed they were going to get a massive cash injection from an anonymous buyer, completely unaware that the buyer was the man standing next to me in a tuxedo. Mason let the applause wash over him, basking in the fraudulent glory. He looked exactly like a man who truly believed his own pathetic lies. But a man does not build an empire alone, Mason said, his voice softening into a tone of manufactured affection. Behind every successful visionary is an incredibly strong and deeply patient partner. I want to take a moment to thank my beautiful wife, Jasmine. He gestured toward the side of the stage where Jasmine was standing in the shadows. She has been my absolute rock, Mason proclaimed smoothly. She stood by my side through the stressful nights and the financial uncertainties. She sacrificed so much to help me reach this incredible peak. Jasmine, darling, please come up here right now and join me. Let us raise a glass to our bright future and toast to the glorious new chapter of our family legacy. A nervous waiter rushed forward, offering Jasmine a crystal flute filled with expensive champagne. The crowd turned their attention toward her, smiling in anticipation of a touching display of marital devotion. Jasmine stepped out of the dark shadows and walked slowly up the plush-carpeted stairs to the grand stage. But as she finally approached Mason, she completely ignored the anxious waiter. She was absolutely not holding a crystal champagne glass. She reached deep into the pocket of her elegant black dress and pulled out a small black plastic remote control. Jasmine held the small black remote high enough for the AV technician in the glass booth at the back of the room to see it. Being a professional event planner, she knew exactly how to commandeer a ballroom audiovisual system. She pressed the primary button with her thumb. The massive digital screens flanking the stage, which had been glowing with a generic gold placeholder logo for Mason's fake firm, suddenly flickered to black. A second later, a towering, high-resolution image illuminated the entire room. It was not a beautiful architectural rendering of a luxury coastal resort. It was a scanned legal document magnified to 20 feet tall. The bold black letters at the top of the screen were impossible to miss. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Right below it, stamped in bright red ink by the county clerk, was an emergency injunction and asset freeze. A wave of profound confusion washed over the wealthy crowd. People lowered their champagne glasses, leaning forward to read the massive legal text. Mason turned around, following their gaze. When he saw the divorce papers projected onto the screen, his jaw dropped so far it looked painful. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head as if trying to physically dislodge the image from his retinas. "What is this?" Mason demanded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched panic through the live microphone. "Jasmine, what are you doing? Turn that off right now." He frantically waved his arms at the glass booth, but the technician did not move. Jasmine had personally hired the AV crew for this event, and they only took orders from her. Jasmine did not flinch. She stepped forward and smoothly pulled the microphone straight out of his trembling hand. She turned to face the sea of elite investors, her posture completely rigid, and her expression carved from solid ice. "Good evening, everyone," Jasmine said, her voice echoing powerfully through the silent ballroom. "My name is Jasmine, and as of 4 hours ago, I am legally filing for divorce from the man standing next to me. I apologize for interrupting this beautiful celebration, but as a self-made business owner, I felt a moral obligation to protect the investors in this room from making a catastrophic financial mistake." Brenda let out a loud, dramatic gasp from the front row, clutching her sequined chest as if she were having a heart attack. She lunged toward the stage steps, but Derek stepped neatly into the aisle, blocking her path with his broad shoulders. He did not say a word. He just crossed his arms and stared her down, forcing her to stay put. "Mason is not a visionary," Jasmine continued, her voice steady and commanding. "He is a degenerate gambler and a pathological liar. The man who just asked you to trust him with millions of your hard-earned dollars has not worked a legitimate day in his entire life. 3 weeks ago, I discovered that my husband had forged my signature to drain my business accounts. He maxed out multiple corporate lines of credit in my name and stole the emergency savings I spent 6 years building for my event planning agency." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. The wealthy bankers and developers were staring at the stage in pure, unadulterated shock. I watched an older banking executive, the same one Brenda had been trying to impress earlier, slowly set his champagne flute down on a passing tray, his face hardening into a mask of professional outrage. "He funneled every single penny of my stolen money into offshore sports betting syndicates," Jasmine revealed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at Mason's chest. "He lost all of it. He is completely leveraged and currently drowning in high-interest debt. This entire lavish event is a desperate smoke and mirror show. The West Coast resort project he just bragged about does not exist. It is a worthless plot of undeveloped swampland. The environmental reports are doctored, and the architectural blueprints are stolen from a discontinued public works project. He is using this fake development to secure your investment capital so he can pay off his illegal gambling debts." Mason was hyperventilating now, sweat pouring down his forehead. "Jasmine, you are crazy," he stammered, lunging forward to grab the microphone back. "She is having a mental breakdown. Do not listen to her." Jasmine sidestepped him with the grace of a matador, letting him stumble past her awkwardly. She refused to let him play the gaslighting card. Not tonight. Not in front of the city elite. She reached up with her left hand and gripped the massive diamond engagement ring on her finger. "You told me this diamond was a family heirloom, Mason," she said, her voice dropping to a lethal, quiet tone that still carried across the massive room. "I had it appraised yesterday morning. It is a piece of cheap cubic zirconia set in plated brass. It is completely worthless. Just like your promises, just like your fake empire, and just like you." Jasmine pulled the ring off her finger. She held it out over the edge of the stage for a fraction of a second before letting it fall. The fake diamond hit the polished wooden floorboards with a sharp metallic clink that echoed loudly through the sound system. She turned her back on her ruined husband and walked calmly down the stairs. The moment her foot touched the carpet, the entire crowd erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked whispers and angry shouts. The chaotic symphony of shocked whispers and angry shouts filled the massive ballroom the moment Jasmine walked away. The elegant facade of the evening completely shattered. High society investors who had been sipping vintage champagne seconds ago were now loudly demanding answers, setting their crystal glasses down. Several wealthy developers were pulling out their cell phones, dialing their financial advisors to freeze pending transfers to my brother's firm. Mason remained frozen on the stage, staring at the divorce petition glowing on the screen behind him, his face pale and dripping with sweat. He was paralyzed by the destruction of his public image. But my mother was not paralyzed. Brenda was a cornered predator fighting for social survival. Realizing Derek was blocking the center aisle, she abandoned all pretense of grace. She shoved her way through a row of expensive chairs, knocking over a silver tray of hors d'oeuvres in her frantic rush to reach the front. She sprinted up the carpeted side stairs of the stage, her silver sequined gown catching on her high heels. She ripped the microphone directly out of Mason's trembling hand, pushing him aside with physical force. She stood at the acrylic podium, her chest heaving as she glared at the restless crowd of elite investors. "Listen to me," she shrieked into the microphone, her voice shrill and echoing through the sound system. "Please, everyone, calm down and listen to me. That woman is completely unhinged. She is a bitter, hysterical liar who is just trying to publicly humiliate my son because she could not handle the pressure of marrying into a prominent, successful family." The crowd did not quiet down. If anything, her aggressive screeching only fueled their outrage. The older banking executive near the front row crossed his arms, clearly disgusted by the display. Brenda saw the elite society she worshipped slipping through her fingers. Her eyes darted around the room, wild with pure desperation. She realized attacking Jasmine was not enough to save the deal. She needed to dazzle them with hard numbers to regain their trust and keep them from calling the federal authorities. "You are all letting a jealous, angry woman cloud your professional business judgment," Brenda yelled, gripping the edges of the podium so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. "Mason is a brilliant developer, and our family legacy is absolutely secure. We are richer and more powerful than we have ever been in our entire lives. The West Coast Resort project is real, and it is already sold." She paused, letting the word "sold" echo across the ballroom. A few of the angry whispers died down, replaced by skeptical curiosity. Brenda smiled, a sharp, manic expression that looked utterly terrifying on her meticulously manicured face. "That is right," she continued, her confidence artificially inflating as she played her absolute best card. "While my pathetic daughter-in-law was busy planning this little theatrical stunt, my son and I were busy closing the largest real estate deal this city has seen in a decade. We did not even need any of your investment capital today. We just wanted to give you the opportunity to join us. But as of yesterday afternoon, we have a fully signed ironclad purchase agreement from a massive international private equity firm." She pointed a trembling finger at the crowd, practically vibrating with arrogant triumph. "D&C Holdings," she announced, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. "One of the most aggressive and wealthy logistics and property conglomerates in the entire country, has completely vetted our project. They reviewed the environmental appraisals. They looked at the architectural blueprints. They recognized the immense, undeniable value of our coastal development. And they have already signed the legally binding acquisition contract." Brenda let out a breathless, triumphant laugh, looking out at the stunned faces of the local elite. "The multi-million-dollar deposit is already secured and resting safely in our escrow account." She lied smoothly, doubling down on her massive gamble. "D&C Holdings does not make mistakes. They are industry titans. If they are willing to spend $40 million to buy our luxury resort project, then you all know perfectly well that my son is a visionary. Our family is completely untouchable." The ballroom fell into a tense, heavy silence as the investors processed this massive claim. Brenda stood tall at the podium, breathing heavily, believing she had successfully put out the fire and saved her fraudulent empire. Then a deep, powerful voice cut through the absolute quiet of the large room. "I would strongly advise against making any more fraudulent claims about my company, Brenda." Derek stepped boldly out of the dark shadows near the main center aisle, buttoning his midnight blue tuxedo jacket as his voice boomed across the incredibly silent room. The entire room collectively held its breath as Derek walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle. The wealthy investors parted for him, immediately stepping aside, as if reacting to a sudden shift in gravity. He was not wearing a rented suit, and he certainly did not look like a lost delivery driver. He carried the heavy, undeniable aura of a man who was entirely used to commanding boardrooms and destroying corporate rivals. I watched him from the back of the room, my heart swelling with absolute pride. This was the man my family had relentlessly mocked for a decade. This was the man they called a downgrade. Brenda stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She tried to regain her composure, pointing a trembling finger at him. Security, she demanded, trying to keep her voice authoritative, but failing miserably as it cracked into a high-pitched screech. "Get this man out of here right now. He is just my daughter's husband. He drives a dirty delivery truck. He is a nobody." Derek stopped right at the base of the stage. He did not even glance at the hotel security guards who were hovering nervously near the ballroom doors, unsure of what to do. He simply reached inside the breast pocket of his bespoke midnight blue tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a sleek matte black business card with raised silver lettering. "I drive a delivery truck occasionally because I enjoy remembering exactly where I started," Derek said, his deep voice completely level but projecting effortlessly across the silent ballroom without the need for a microphone. He turned his body slightly to address the crowd of elite investors holding the business card up for the front rows to clearly see. "Allow me to formally introduce myself to those of you I have not yet had the pleasure of doing business with. My name is Derek." He paused, letting his piercing gaze sweep the room before locking directly onto Brenda. "And I am the founder, sole owner, and chief executive officer of DNC Holdings." A collective audible gasp rippled through the front rows of the audience. The older banking executive actually took a step back, his eyes widening as he recognized the name and the face from prestigious industry financial profiles. Brenda gripped the acrylic podium so hard the plastic groaned under the pressure. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow, aged, and terrified. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in violent, desperate denial. "No, that is completely impossible. D&C is a billion-dollar conglomerate. You are a mechanic. You are a low-class grease monkey. You do not have that kind of capital." "The D stands for Derek, and the C stands for Cassidy," Derek explained smoothly, a dangerous, predatory smile playing on his lips. "I incorporated the holding company the very same year I married your daughter. The brilliant daughter you spent your entire life treating like absolute garbage. The daughter you tried to frame for federal tax fraud just 2 days ago. While you were busy mocking my work boots and my faded jeans at your little family dinners, I was busy building a national supply chain empire. I own the commercial warehouses, I own the shipping fleets, and I own the boardrooms." Mason let out a pathetic whimpering sound from his spot near the projection screen. His knees literally buckled under his weight, and he had to desperately grab the metal edge of the screen frame to keep from collapsing onto the floor. The arrogant golden child was finally realizing that the man he had verbally abused in my kitchen yesterday held his entire financial future in the palm of his hand. "When my wife informed me that you were desperately trying to offload a highly suspicious luxury resort development to cover your stolen trust fund money, I had my corporate acquisitions department look into it," Derek continued, taking one slow, deliberate step up the stage stairs. Brenda physically shrank back in fear. "We operated through a blind corporate proxy. That is exactly why you never saw my name on any of the preliminary paperwork, Brenda. You were so incredibly blinded by the $40 million purchase offer that you eagerly signed the binding legal agreement without doing a single background check on your own buyer. You handed the keys to your fake kingdom directly to me." Brenda was completely paralyzed. Her silver sequined gown suddenly looked ridiculous, a cheap costume on a woman who had just been utterly destroyed. She could not speak. She could not move. The elite society she had worshipped her entire life was watching her get dismantled piece by piece. Derek stood tall, buttoning his jacket once more, his expression hardening into absolute unforgiving stone. "As the chief executive officer of the purchasing entity, I have the absolute legal authority to enforce every single condition of that contract." Derek stared dead into Brenda's terrified eyes. "And because your son just had his doctored environmental reports and stolen architectural blueprints publicly exposed in front of 50 witnesses, I am officially invoking the fraud clause to terminate the purchase agreement immediately." The silence that followed Derek's declaration was absolute and suffocating. The elite investors in the room were no longer just angry. They were witnessing a corporate execution on a scale rarely seen outside of closed boardrooms. Brenda staggered backward, her high heels catching on the carpeted steps. She looked as though she had been physically struck. The multi-million-dollar lifeline she had desperately engineered to save her son from prison and herself from ruin had evaporated into thin air. I stepped forward, moving out of the shadows and walking up to stand proudly right next to my husband. The emerald green silk of my custom gown brushed against his midnight blue tuxedo. I looked down at my mother and my brother, feeling absolutely no pity for the monsters they had become. But the corporate termination was only the first half of the trap. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a folded stack of papers. It was the exact same legal document Richard had tried to force me to sign in his office a few days ago. The pages were still aggressively slashed and circled in my heavy red fountain pen ink. Even if Derek had not invoked the fraud clause to terminate the acquisition, I projected my voice clearly across the massive room. This real estate deal was dead on arrival. I held up the ruined quitclaim deed for the entire crowd of investors to see. You see, everyone, my mother and my brother, forgot to mention one very important legal detail about the West Coast Resort project. They do not own the land they were trying to sell you tonight. Brenda let out a small, strangled gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. That barren plot of swampland is legally bound to my late grandfather's irrevocable family trust. I explained, my tone sharp and authoritative, slipping easily into my professional forensic accounting persona. According to the strict terms of that trust, no property can be liquidated, transferred, or used as collateral without the explicit notarized consent of every living beneficiary. I am a primary beneficiary. And as you can clearly see from the red ink on this fraudulent document, I refuse to sign away my legal rights. I turned my gaze back to the crowd, making direct eye contact with the older banking executive who had been listening intently. Any purchase agreement Brenda and Mason signed this week is null and void. But it gets significantly worse. The reason my mother was so desperate to sell this worthless property was not to build a family legacy. It was to cover up a massive federal crime. For the past 3 years, Brenda has been illegally siphoning millions out of the trust principal to fund Mason's offshore gambling addiction. She drained the accounts and forged the distribution logs. The whispers erupted again, louder this time, filled with genuine outrage. When the federal auditors started closing in on the estate, they panicked. I continued raising my voice to cut through the chaos in the ballroom. They needed $40 million to replace the stolen funds before the government discovered the discrepancy. Mason doctored the environmental reports, stole public architectural blueprints, and they threw this lavish party to con all of you into bailing them out. They were willing to let you sink your investment capital into a legally frozen piece of swampland that already has multiple federal tax liens attached to it. The checkmate was complete. The intricate, toxic web of lies my family had spent years meticulously spinning had been completely torn to shreds in under 10 minutes. Mason was now openly weeping on the stage, his face buried in his hands as the crushing reality of his impending federal prison sentence crashed down upon him. He was no longer the arrogant golden child. He was just a pathetic, broken fraud. Brenda looked completely destroyed. The wealthy high society friends she had spent her entire adult life trying to impress were now looking at her with pure disgust. Several prominent investors were already speed-walking toward the main exit, loudly instructing their legal teams over their cell phones to sever all financial ties with my family immediately. The local elite would never speak to her again. She was a total social pariah. I scanned the chaotic, rapidly shifting crowd, feeling a deep, profound sense of closure. But as my eyes swept over the panicked attendees rushing toward the main entrance, I caught a sudden, frantic flash of movement near the catering stations at the very back of the room. Moving quickly through the dark shadows, desperately trying to avoid any attention, was Richard. The shady, corrupt lawyer who had orchestrated the fake documents was trying to slip quietly out the back doors of the ballroom. I did not hesitate. I walked past my mother, who was frozen in shock near the podium, and grabbed the microphone out of her trembling hand. She was too terrified to put up physical resistance. I gripped the metal microphone, turned on my heel, and locked my eyes onto the cowardly figure trying to escape into the lobby. Leaving so soon, Richard, I projected my voice clearly through the massive sound system. The sudden boom caused Richard to freeze instantly. He was mere inches away from the heavy brass handle of the exit doors. At his name, hundreds of heads swiveled in unison, locking their judgmental gazes onto the panicked lawyer in the gray suit. He looked like a guilty rat caught in a bright floodlight. "Richard Evans, ladies and gentlemen," I announced to the captivated audience, pointing a steady finger directly at him. "He is the legal mind behind this criminal operation. You cannot orchestrate a multi-million-dollar federal tax evasion scheme and forge trust fund distributions without a corrupt attorney willing to notarize the fake documents." Richard turned around slowly, his face glowing with a sickly pale sheen of terror. "Cassidy, please," he stammered, holding his hands up in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "You do not need to do this in front of everyone. We can talk privately. We can come to an arrangement." "There are no more private arrangements, Richard," I replied, my voice ringing with cold, absolute authority. "You tried to trap me in your office on Tuesday morning. You tried to force me to sign a falsified quitclaim deed, making me legally responsible for the millions you helped my mother steal. You thought because I was estranged I would be an easy target for your scam, but you made a fatal miscalculation." I stepped off the stage and walked slowly down the center aisle toward him. The wealthy investors parted for me, creating a clear path straight to the terrified lawyer. "You deliberately used your private legal email server to transmit those fraudulent financial records," I explained, outlining his exact crimes for the elite crowd. "You wrongly assumed attorney-client privilege would protect you from a federal audit. But legal privilege does not apply when a lawyer actively helps a desperate client commit a felony. It is legally called the crime fraud exception. As a forensic accountant, I know exactly how to digitally trace those encrypted emails right back to your personal network address." Richard's hands began to shake violently at his sides. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a white handkerchief to wipe the heavy sweat dripping down his forehead. "I meticulously compiled every single one of your digital footprints, Richard," I told him, stopping a few feet away. "I traced the illegal wire transfers you authorized from the family trust directly into Mason's offshore sports gambling accounts. I documented the fake tax ledgers you signed off on, and yesterday afternoon, I forwarded that heavily encrypted digital dossier directly to the State Bar Association and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division." A collective shocked gasp rippled through the remaining crowd. The older banking executive shook his head in absolute disgust, pulling out his cell phone to dial his own corporate legal compliance team. "You are going to lose your law license, Richard," I stated, firmly staring him down. "And then you are going to federal prison for facilitating wire fraud and conspiracy to commit grand larceny." The crushing reality of his destroyed life finally crashed down on him. Richard cracked under the intense pressure. The smug, condescending patriarch who had treated me like a foolish little girl days ago vanished into thin air. He looked wildly at the angry crowd and pointed a shaking finger back toward the stage where Brenda was still standing. "She made me do it!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking in sheer panic. "Brenda forced me. She told me she would ruin my law firm if I did not help her cover up Mason's massive debts. She is a monster. I just drafted what she specifically told me to draft. It was her idea." Brenda let out a furious, animalistic shriek. "You pathetic, lying coward," she yelled back, her face turning a deep, ugly shade of purple. "I will destroy you, Richard." But Richard did not wait to hear her threats. He spun around, slammed his body weight against the heavy brass handles of the grand exit doors, and sprinted out into the lobby, abandoning his wealthy clients to face the music alone. The moment the heavy doors swung shut behind the fleeing lawyer, the ballroom exploded. The fragile silence shattered into total chaos. The elite investors, the very people Brenda had spent decades trying to impress, had finally seen enough. They were leaving in disgust. The mass exodus was remarkably swift for a room full of people wearing heavy designer gowns and expensive tuxedos. Within 3 minutes, the grand ballroom was entirely emptied of its high society guests. The elite investors practically trampled each other to get out the door, eager to put as much distance as possible between their own pristine reputations and our completely radioactive family. Even the catering staff quietly slipped away, leaving behind tables cluttered with half-empty crystal champagne flutes and discarded hors d'oeuvres. The heavy gilded doors swung shut for the final time, leaving a hollow, ringing silence in their wake. The only people left in the massive glittering room were me, Derek, Jasmine, and the two exposed frauds standing on the stage. With the audience completely gone, the polished illusion my mother had spent her entire life protecting instantly shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The toxic dynamic that had always simmered beneath the surface of our family finally boiled over in spectacular fashion. Mason wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, his breathing ragged and uneven. He looked at the empty room and then turned his panicked gaze toward Brenda. The golden child was completely cornered, and like any coward, his first instinct was to aggressively deflect the blame. "This is all your fault," Mason screamed, pointing an accusatory finger right at our mother's face. His voice cracked, echoing harshly off the crystal chandeliers overhead. "You pushed me into this, Brenda. You told me I had to be a massive success. You told me I had to buy the luxury cars and join the elite country club so you could brag about me to your rich friends." Brenda stared at him, her eyes wide with absolute disbelief. She was still reeling from the devastating social humiliation, and now her perfect son was actively turning against her. "You forced me to keep up appearances." Mason continued, his face contorting with ugly, raw anger. "When my first business failed, you told me to lie. You told me we just had to project wealth until it became a reality. You are the one who actually stole from Grandpa's trust fund. I never asked you to commit a federal crime. I just asked for a loan. You dragged me into this massive tax fraud because you were too obsessed with what other people thought of us." Brenda let out a sharp, furious breath. She stepped forward, raising her right hand, and slapped Mason directly across the face with all her might. The sound was a loud, sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot through the empty ballroom. Mason stumbled backward, clutching his red cheek, his eyes watering in absolute shock. "You ungrateful, pathetic little boy!" Brenda shrieked, her voice completely devoid of any maternal warmth. "I gave you absolutely everything. I sacrificed my own financial security to save you from your own pathetic failures. You lost millions of dollars gambling on offshore sports games. You threw away every single advantage I ever handed to you." She stepped closer to him, jabbing her finger hard into his chest. "I forged those documents to keep you out of a federal penitentiary," she yelled. "I risked my entire life to bail you out, and you could not even close a simple real estate deal. You are completely useless, Mason. You have always been completely useless. You are just a hollow failure wrapped in an expensive suit that I paid for." I stood next to Derek, watching the two of them absolutely tear each other apart. It was a vicious, ugly display, but it was also profoundly cathartic. For 33 years, I had internalized their cruelty. I believed my career as a forensic accountant was a boring disappointment compared to Mason's brilliant entrepreneurial spirit. But looking at them now, screaming and physically fighting on a stage surrounded by the ruins of their fake empire, I finally understood the absolute truth. They were a fragile house of cards, held together by nothing but lies, mutual resentment, and stolen money. I had never been the problem. I was simply the mirror that reflected their incredibly ugly reality, which was exactly why they hated me so much. Jasmine walked over and stood right beside me, crossing her arms. She looked at the pathetic scene unfolding on the stage and let out a heavy sigh of genuine relief. Her posture was completely relaxed for the first time since I met her. "They truly deserve each other," Jasmine said quietly, her voice laced with absolute finality. I nodded, leaning my head against Derek's solid shoulder. "Yes, they do," I replied. "They spent their whole lives feeding off each other. Now there is nothing left to consume but themselves." Mason lunged forward again, screaming a string of vicious curses at Brenda, blaming her for ruining his marriage and his entire life. She pushed him back wildly, her manicured nails tearing the lapel of his expensive velvet dinner jacket. The golden child and the narcissistic mother were locked in a desperate, miserable battle for the ultimate role of the victim, completely oblivious to the fact that the game was officially over. But their pathetic family drama was suddenly and violently interrupted by the outside world. Through the sheer white curtains covering the massive floor-to-ceiling hotel windows, the dark city street outside suddenly illuminated. Brilliant, intense flashes of blue and red lights cut through the glass painting the elegant ballroom walls in a frantic spinning pattern. A second later, the loud, piercing wail of multiple approaching sirens filled the night air, growing louder and more urgent as the emergency vehicles completely surrounded the front entrance of the historic building. The heavy gilded doors of the grand ballroom did not just open. They were shoved apart with a forceful, synchronized precision that silenced the remaining echoes of my family arguing. A team of men and women dressed in dark suits and navy blue windbreakers stormed into the empty room. Their dark jackets bore the bold yellow initials IRSCID. Over a dozen federal agents quickly fanned out across the massive space, securing all exits and establishing a perimeter. A tall, broad special agent with cropped gray hair led the squad. He held a thick manila folder in his left hand. He bypassed the catering tables and marched toward the stage where my mother and brother were standing frozen in terror. Brenda stopped pulling at Mason's torn velvet jacket. Mason stopped sobbing long enough to stare at the approaching federal agents with wide, bloodshot eyes. The only sound was the heavy thud of tactical boots marching across the polished wooden floorboards. The lead agent stopped right at the base of the stage stairs. He opened the manila folder and looked up, reading from an official document. Brenda and Mason, he announced, his voice projecting with practiced, absolute authority. We are executing a federal search and seizure warrant regarding the Irrevocable Family Trust and all affiliated shell corporations. We also have federal arrest warrants for both of you on charges of wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. Mason let out a sound resembling a deflating tire. His knees finally gave out entirely, and he collapsed onto the carpeted stage floor, sitting in a pathetic heap. When two younger federal agents walked up the stairs and demanded his electronic devices, Mason did not even attempt to argue. He simply reached into his pocket with trembling hands and surrendered his expensive smartphone. He was completely broken. But Brenda was a completely different story. The narcissistic queen of the local country club refused to believe her reign was over. When a female agent approached her and calmly asked her to hand over her silver designer clutch purse, Brenda violently snatched it away, clutching it tightly to her sequined chest. "Absolutely not!" Brenda shrieked, her voice pitching upward into a hysterical screech. "You have absolutely no right to barge into my private gala and demand my personal property. This is a massive misunderstanding. You are making a terrible mistake. Hand over the purse and place your hands behind your back." The female agent instructed, her tone perfectly, even and professional. "Do not make this difficult." "Do you have any idea who I am?" Brenda yelled, taking a defiant step forward and pointing a manicured finger directly at the agent's face. "I am a highly respected member of this community. I sit on the board of 3 different charitable foundations. I have the mayor of this city on speed dial. You cannot treat me like some common street criminal. I will have your badge for this. I will sue this entire department for harassment and public defamation." The lead agent at the bottom of the stairs let out a heavy, exhausted sigh. "Your social status does not exempt you from federal law, he stated flatly. "You are actively interfering with a federal investigation. Give the agent your bag immediately, or you will be charged with resisting arrest." Brenda completely lost her mind. She raised her hand and actually attempted to swat the federal agent's arm away. It was the absolute worst mistake she could have possibly made. The female agent did not even blink. With lightning-fast precision, she grabbed Brenda's raised wrist, twisted it sharply but safely behind her back, and forced my mother to turn around. Brenda let out a shocked gasp, dropping the silver designer clutch onto the stage. The heavy metallic click of cold steel handcuffs snapping shut around her wrists echoed loudly through the silent ballroom. You cannot do this to me, Brenda wailed, struggling uselessly against the tight metal restraints as the agent began reading her Miranda rights. She was completely humiliated, stripped of her fake wealth, and exposed for the fraud she truly was. Panic finally overrode her arrogant anger. Brenda twisted her head around, desperately scanning the room until her terrified eyes locked directly onto mine. I was standing quietly next to Derek, watching the entire scene unfold with absolute calm. Cassidy, Brenda begged, her voice trembling with genuine pathetic fear. Cassidy, please help me. Tell them it is a mistake. Call a lawyer. Call anyone. Please do not let them take me away. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life trying to destroy my self-worth. I realized I felt absolutely nothing for her anymore. I simply smiled a cold and final smile and then turned my back. I walked down the plush, carpeted steps of the stage, leaving my mother to face the reality of her own actions. Derek was waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs, his hand outstretched. I took it, and we walked down the center aisle together. Jasmine fell into step right beside us. We did not look back. The sounds of Brenda screaming at the federal agents and Mason openly sobbing faded into a muffled hum as we pushed through the heavy gilded doors and exited the grand ballroom. The hotel lobby was completely deserted of the high society crowd. The elite investors had vanished into the night, leaving behind a surreal silence. We walked across the polished marble floors, our footsteps echoing loudly in the empty space. No one spoke. We did not need to. The heavy, oppressive weight of the toxic family dynamic that had suffocated me for 33 years had finally been lifted. We stepped through the revolving glass doors and out into the crisp, cool evening air. The contrast between the chaotic, humid ballroom and the peaceful city street was incredibly jarring, but immensely refreshing. Several federal vehicles were parked haphazardly on the cobblestone driveway, their red and blue emergency lights flashing against the historic brick facade of the hotel. Derek guided us past the chaotic scene toward the far end of the valet lane. His personal driver was waiting there, but he was not standing next to the sleek black town car we had arrived in. Per Derek's earlier quiet instruction, the driver had returned to our house and brought Derek's beat-up 10-year-old pickup truck to the venue. It was the ultimate poetic exit. The vehicle my family had mocked relentlessly was now our chariot away from their destruction. We stopped right next to the dented steel bumper of the heavy diesel truck. Jasmine leaned her back against the side of the vehicle and let out a massive, trembling sigh. It was a deep, physical exhale that seemed to carry years of built-up anxiety and manufactured stress out of her body. She closed her eyes, tilting her head back to feel the cool night breeze on her face. For a long moment, she just breathed, savoring the pure, undeniable taste of freedom. I cannot believe it is actually over, Jasmine said quietly, opening her dark eyes to look at me. When I found those encrypted files on his computer, I felt so completely trapped. I thought I was going to lose the business I spent my entire life building. I thought I was going to be dragged down into federal court right alongside them. Cassidy, you did not just save my event planning agency tonight. You saved my entire life. You saved yourself, Jasmine, I told her softly, stepping closer. You were the one smart enough to clone his hard drive. You were the one brave enough to stand on that stage tonight and expose him in front of the entire city. I just did the math. You pulled the trigger. Jasmine smiled, a genuine warm expression that entirely transformed her face. She shook her head, crossing her arms over her elegant black dress. Brenda worked so incredibly hard to keep us completely separated, she noted, her voice laced with sudden clarity. She knew exactly what she was doing. She used her subtle racism and her blatant classism to build a massive wall between us. She paraded me around her country club friends like a token prize to prove how progressive she was, while privately criticizing my background. And she fed me constant lies about you to make sure we never compared notes. She pitted us against each other because she knew that if we ever joined forces, we would completely dismantle her. I nodded, feeling a deep surge of agreement. She thrived on isolation, I replied. She needed you to feel like an outsider who had to constantly earn your place, and she needed me to feel like a failure who would never be good enough. But she completely underestimated both of us. Jasmine reached out and wrapped her arms tightly around my shoulders. I hugged her back fiercely, closing my eyes and holding on to the brilliant, resilient woman who had walked into the fire with me. It was a deep, sisterly hug. It carried all the mutual respect and genuine affection that my biological family had never been capable of offering. In that quiet moment, standing by the dusty pickup truck under the flashing police lights, I realized I had finally found a real sister. "Thank you for everything," Jasmine whispered, stepping back and wiping a single happy tear from her cheek. A sleek black Uber pulled up to the curb right behind Derek's truck. Jasmine opened the rear door, pausing for one brief second to look back at the Grand Hotel. Inside that building, her fraudulent husband and her manipulative mother-in-law were currently being read their Miranda rights. She smiled a brilliant, victorious smile. Then she got into the car, closed the door, and rode off into the city, leaving them to their fate, completely and entirely free. 6 months passed since that explosive night in the downtown district. The transition from the chaotic aftermath of the gala to our new, peaceful reality was remarkably swift. When the federal government moves against tax evasion and wire fraud, they do not leave any room for negotiation. They move with a cold, mechanical efficiency that absolutely decimated the fake empire my family had spent years meticulously building. Brenda did not go back to her sprawling colonial house that night. She never stepped foot inside it again. Within 72 hours of her public arrest, the Internal Revenue Service officially seized all of her physical assets, freezing every single bank account tied to her name and the fraudulent trust. The sprawling estate she loved to brag about was immediately foreclosed upon, auctioned off to the highest bidder to cover a fraction of the millions she owed the government. Today, the former queen of the local country club is living in a cheap rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. It is a depressing cinder-block building with a neon sign that constantly flickers, completely devoid of the luxury and status she worshipped. She spends her days sitting in a small room that smells of stale cigarette smoke, watching daytime television. She is currently out on bail, wearing a bulky government-issued ankle monitor while she anxiously awaits her federal trial for tax evasion and conspiracy. Her high-priced defense attorney dropped her the moment her funds were frozen, leaving her to rely on an overworked public defender who has already advised her to accept a harsh plea deal. The social fallout for Brenda was even more devastating than the financial ruin. The elite country club friends she had spent decades manipulating and impressing completely erased her from their collective memory. When a local investigative journalist reached out to the banking executives and socialites who had attended the ruined gala, every single one of them claimed they barely knew her. They stated she was just a casual acquaintance who had aggressively exaggerated their friendship. She became a cautionary tale, whispered about at upscale brunch tables, a ghost completely banished from the high society she had sold her very soul to impress. Mason faced a similar crushing dose of harsh reality. The golden child who had spent his entire adult life parading around in leased sports cars and custom velvet jackets was finally forced to enter the actual workforce. During the divorce proceedings, Jasmine presented the decrypted files from his hard drive directly to the judge. The forensic evidence was so undeniable that the court ordered Mason to pay full and immediate restitution for every single penny he had stolen from her event planning agency. Because his shell companies were seized and liquidated by the federal investigators, he had absolutely no hidden wealth to fall back on. Now the visionary real estate developer is working a grueling minimum wage job at a massive commercial home improvement warehouse. He spends his days wearing a bright orange uniform apron, loading heavy bags of concrete and landscaping mulch into the back of customer pickup trucks. Because his Porsche was repossessed and his credit is completely destroyed, he is forced to take the public city bus to work every morning. Every Friday, the state legally garnishes 70% of his meager paycheck, transferring the funds directly into Jasmine's corporate accounts to slowly repay his massive debt. He lost his fake luxury life, his beautiful wife, and his arrogant pride in one single devastating blow. Jasmine, on the other hand, rebranded her agency and just secured a massive contract to organize a national tech conference. She is thriving completely untethered from his toxic dead weight. As for Derek and me, our lives returned to a state of profound, uninterrupted peace. D&C Holdings continued to expand completely untouched by the scandal that destroyed my mother and brother. Derek secured 2 new national shipping routes, and I returned to my forensic accounting firm satisfied that the biggest fraud case of my career had been successfully closed. We spent our weekends renovating a vintage Airstream trailer, completely ignoring the toxic drama of the past. I no longer checked my phone expecting a gaslighting text message, and I no longer felt the heavy burden of trying to prove my worth to people who were fundamentally incapable of loving me. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the final piece of the puzzle unexpectedly arrived. I had just finished a long client audit and walked down the long paved driveway to check our secure mailbox. Amidst the usual stack of corporate catalogs and minor utility bills, I noticed a thick, heavily sealed envelope made of high-quality, crisp parchment. I pulled it out my eyes, instantly drawn to the bold official seal printed in the upper left corner. It was a formal communication from the Department of the Treasury sent directly from the Internal Revenue Service whistleblower office in Washington, District of Columbia. I stood in the warm afternoon sun, staring at my printed name, knowing exactly what was waiting inside. I ran my thumb under the heavy seal of the thick parchment envelope, breaking it open with a crisp tear. Standing there in the warm afternoon sun, I carefully pulled out the stack of government documents. The top page was a formal letter from the director of the Federal Whistleblower Program detailing the successful prosecution and the total amount of stolen trust assets they had recovered from the offshore syndicates. Clipped to the back of the letter was a cashier check printed on secure federal watermarked paper. I stared at the numbers printed across the center line, my breath catching slightly in my throat. It was my legal 15% cut of the recovered funds. I knew my grandfather had left behind a massive estate, but seeing the actual recovered millions calculated right there in black and white was staggering. It was a large sum of money, but as I held that heavy check in my hands, I did not feel a rush of typical greed. I felt a profound sense of absolute validation. The United States government had looked at my forensic accounting work, verified my meticulous financial timeline, and used it to execute justice. I walked slowly back up the long paved driveway, clutching the federal envelope against my chest. Derek was sitting on the wide wraparound wooden porch of our house, enjoying the quiet afternoon breeze. He had a glass of iced tea resting on the small table next to his rocking chair, and his laptop open on his knees. He looked up as my boots crunched on the gravel path, instantly recognizing the shocked expression on my face. He set his computer aside and stood up, walking over to the top of the porch stairs. I did not say a single word. I just walked up the wooden steps and handed him the federal check. Derek looked down at the massive string of numbers, his eyebrows shooting up in genuine surprise. He let out a low, impressed whistle and looked back up at me with that signature proud smile. "Well, Cassidy," he said, his deep voice rumbling with warm amusement. "It looks like your accounting skills just officially paid out a massive dividend. What exactly do you want to do with a sudden multi-million-dollar federal bonus? We certainly do not need it to pay our mortgage." I sat down on the comfortable porch swing, taking a deep breath of the fresh suburban air. He was entirely right. D&C Holdings was generating massive profits, and my own firm was thriving. We did not need the whistleblower's reward to sustain our beautiful life. I looked out over the lush green lawn, remembering the man who had originally built that wealth. My grandfather was a hardworking, honest man who wanted his legacy to provide security for his descendants. Brenda had taken that noble intention and corrupted it, turning his life savings into a slush fund for her golden child's gambling addiction. "I want to give it back," I said firmly, looking Derek in the eye. "I want to take every single penny of this reward and establish a legitimate educational foundation in my grandfather's true honor." Brenda used to brag about running a fake charity in his name just to elevate her country club status. We are going to strip her name from his legacy entirely. We will set up a massive scholarship fund dedicated strictly to helping young underprivileged women pursue degrees in forensic accounting and corporate law. We will help them build the exact same skills I used to dismantle my mother's fake empire. Derek smiled, leaning down to kiss my forehead. That is the most brilliant and beautiful revenge I have ever heard, he murmured in total agreement. We spent the rest of the afternoon sitting quietly on the porch, sketching out the legal framework for the new educational foundation. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across our quiet, peaceful property, I leaned my head against Derek's solid shoulder and watched the evening sky change colors. I felt a deep, profound sense of closure settle over my heart. For decades, I had been chained to the toxic, chaotic cycle of my biological family. I had let their constant criticism and their emotional manipulation dictate my own self-worth. I had believed the societal lie that you must absolutely tolerate cruelty just because the people hurting you share your bloodline. But sitting there on my beautiful porch, holding the hand of a man who truly respected and protected me, I finally understood the incredible power of walking away. Establishing rigid boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You simply cannot heal in the exact same toxic environment that made you sick. Society places an incredibly heavy and unfair burden on women when it comes to family dynamics. From a very young age, we are constantly conditioned to be the unconditional peacekeepers. We are told over and over again that blood is thicker than water, and that we must forgive our toxic relatives simply because we share the same DNA. Whenever a mother is cruel or a brother is manipulative, people immediately rush to excuse their horrific behavior. They say things like, "She is still your mother," or "He is just going through a hard time." We are expected to swallow our pride, ignore our intuition, and sit quietly at holiday dinners while the people who are supposed to protect us actively tear us down. But the truth is that sharing a genetic lineage does not give anyone a free pass to continuously abuse you, disrespect your boundaries, or commit federal crimes in your name. Forgiving someone who actively plots your downfall is not a virtue. It is an act of profound self-sabotage that will slowly eat away at your sanity. For 33 years, I believed the terrible lie that I was the broken one because I could not force myself to fit into my mother's completely warped version of reality. I let her dictate my worth. I allowed her to mock my career as a forensic accountant and insult my husband because I was terrified of being permanently alienated from the only family I had ever known. But alienating myself from Brenda and Mason was the absolute greatest gift I could have ever given myself. People often ask me if I feel any lingering guilt about what happened to them. They ask if I regret sending my own mother to face a federal prison sentence or reducing my entitled brother to working a minimum wage retail job. My answer is always a resounding and unapologetic no. I did not destroy their lives. Their own rampant greed, their pathological lying, and their monumental arrogance destroyed their lives. I simply refused to be the human shield they used to block the natural consequences of their own horrific actions. When Brenda handed me that fraudulent quitclaim deed, she thought she was handing me my financial death sentence. Instead, she handed me the exact weapon I needed to finally set myself completely free. When you finally find the courage to walk away from the people who only value you for what they can aggressively extract from you, a beautiful thing happens. You create the necessary physical and emotional space to let true family enter your life. True family is not determined by a birth certificate or a legal document. True family is built entirely on mutual respect, unwavering support, and radical honesty. True family is my husband Derek, who saw my absolute true value when my own mother called me a pathetic failure. He built a national logistics empire with his own two bare hands, but never once made me feel like my professional accomplishments were less important than his. He is my truest partner in every sense of the word. True family is also Jasmine, a woman who was carefully manipulated by Brenda to be my bitter enemy, but who ultimately became my closest and most trusted ally. We bonded over our shared survival, we validated each other's lived experiences, and we helped each other escape the exact same nightmare. Today our lives are defined by profound peace, instead of constant manufactured panic. We do not have to look over our shoulders or worry about the next financial disaster knocking on our front door. The Educational Scholarship Foundation we set up using the federal whistleblower reward has already helped 12 brilliant young women pay for their advanced accounting degrees this year alone. We took a dark legacy of theft and manipulation and actively transformed it into a bright legacy of female empowerment and genuine education. We successfully broke the generational curse, and we did it by absolutely refusing to stay silent any longer. You do not have to accept the assigned role of the family scapegoat. You have the immense power to completely rewrite your own narrative, and you have the absolute, undeniable right to demand basic human respect. Your peace of mind is worth infinitely more than the highly conditional and entirely fake love of a toxic parent. If you have ever had to cut off a toxic relative or if a piece of paper changed your life, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and keeping the receipts.